Since Einarsson last exhibited at Bergen Kunsthall alongside Matias Faldbakken in 2004, he has positioned himself as one of Norway's most highly profiled contemporary artists. For the past decade, his exhibition practice has followed a highly consistent thematic line. Each new exhibition can be seen as a new stage in an ongoing tracing of what could be called the iconography of resistance. The signs and symbols that can be read out of Einarsson's works refer to fundamental conflictual structures between a society of control from the period after September 11, 2001, and the individual's rebellion against and threat to central power. At the same time, Einarsson refers to historical examples of tragic, failed attempts to achieve such individual freedom. The visual language associated with the exercise of power and rebellion is also linked by Einarsson with the art world of which he is himself a part of, and which in many ways is also driven by a utopian and often also failed impulse to resist. The avant-garde ideal and the notion of the artist as totally emancipated individual run through the artistic history of modernism. And Einarsson has deliberately and strategically chosen to work with this theme through art's own semiotic system and within the institutional field of art, and with the self-referential formal language that constitutes the arena of contemporary art. And in the same way as the culture of resistance to which he often refers, he has also recognized the field of art as a system that balances exactly between communication and exclusion, where issues of style, the construction of mythology, and real political conflict can all be played out at the same time. Now, I will not go very much into detail about the present exhibition. I guess that the conversation will touch in upon on that, and probably most of you have seen the exhibition. It's downstairs. But just a little bit more introduction to why we are here today. We are very happy, of course, to have with us Gardar, together with American curator and writer Bob Nikas. Bob Nikas is a critic and independent curator, a regular contributor to Art Forum, and his writings and interviews have also appeared in numerous catalogs and monographs, as well as several journals and magazines. I can mention just a few of his latest book publications. Theft is Vision, Collected Writings and Interviews, that was from 2008. And Painting Abstraction, New Elements in Abstract Painting, that was from 2009. And Nikas also contributes with a new essay in the book that we are publishing together with Sternberg Press on the occasion of this exhibition. So you can find both of these publications in the bookstore. There's the big one, and there's also a smaller one with Norwegian translations and with images from the show. In addition to Bob's text, there's also a text by Martin Herbert and one by Nick Land. Nikas' contribution is a text that finds its place somewhere in between a catalog essay and a fictional story. In his text, he situates the reader in a science fiction-inspired future scenario where a book that turns out to be an exhibition catalog forms the basis for the two main characters in this story and their attempt to penetrate into the artist's universe of science. This text is interesting in several ways. First of all, the text takes on an important role in the book because it's the one essay in the book that most directly deals with the new works that we see in the exhibition. But then the form of the text, written as a fictional story, taking place in the future, is of course unusual within an exhibition catalog like this, where essays more commonly looks back at an artist's previous practice in order to shed light on the current work. So, after this introduction, I'd like to start off the conversation actually by directing a couple of questions to the two of you. First of all, it would be interesting to hear a little bit about how the two of you have been working along the way, because another interesting thing about the text is, of course, that it talks about artworks that we now can see in the exhibition, but that were not finished yet when the text was written. So my two questions would be, how did the two of you work together when planning a text about an exhibition that had not happened yet? And secondly, why did the text end up in a fictional format in the way that it did?
Okay. I didn't prepare anything, so this morning at breakfast I thought I really should try to come up with something. And interestingly enough, a short thing that I wrote addresses that last question. So if you'll bear with me before the conversation starts, I'm going to try to set the stage a little bit. Okay. Science fiction, or a certain kind of writing that is set in the near future and deals with its myths, the myths of the near future, is really imaginative fiction. And so you're really dealing with the behavior of individuals in the society and the society at large at present as a means of accessing what's to come. Human behavior and social organization don't advance very dramatically from one period to another. I don't think so. So science fiction is closer to science fact. And artists who deal with the reality of representation in the here and now can be thought of, in a sense, as engaging with social science. And so their work, what they do, may have a useful function in society. And they have a responsibility within the culture. Recently, I began work on a short text about representation, pictorial representation, but in terms of how everything we say and everything we do represents and thus has meaning. And I've titled this text, Myths of the Painted Future. And my thesis, such as it is, rests on a simple assertion. The painted prediction doesn't have to come true, it only has to be made. This brings us back to the idea of a certain type of writing as imaginative fiction. And this relates to Gardar Eide Einarsson's, what I call acts of translation. Language, of course, is a symbolic world. And visual language, dealing with signs and symbols, as Gardar's work does, can participate in an investigation. Investigation isn't really the precise word, but a kind of detective work, investigation of meaning within the current narrative. And this narrative, of course, is a prelude of what's to come. Speaking of what's to come, the works that I wrote about in large part didn't exist when I had to start writing the text, and I didn't see them until I came here, and the text had already been done for, 2 months. So they didn't exist, at least physically in large part, when I began writing for the catalog. So my only recourse was to that genre of imaginative fiction, which I consider a fiction based in fact. And my final comment, it's a bit dense. Someone once asked me if I have ever written fiction, and I looked at them with some slight disbelief and said, well, no, but I have been writing about art for over 25 years. So that's like saying, isn't it the same thing? It's your turn. I don't know. I don't know if I really, what I think of that. It's all new. But it's definitely something that I wrote after the fact, after having written the text, then seeing the work, seeing the show, and then being at this point now.
Yeah, just maybe for clarification, we should just describe how this text was written. Bob and I live really close to each other, like on the same block, basically. So,
except when you're in Tokyo.
Yes. So Bob would just come over like once a week, and we would talk about the work that I was going to make. None of the work existed. In terms of its physical shape, it hadn't even been started. Like, I knew what I wanted to do, but I had not done it at all. So it was funny to have, at some point, we had your text before we had basically any of the work. I think I actually even sent part of your text as like, that's what this piece will look like. Which was really fun. It was pretty fun. It's the first time I've had a text that's but we did meet a lot. So the text is quite specific to each piece.
Yeah, but when I went to the studio, we met a lot, but there wasn't a lot of work. The thing, you have artists today who don't have studios. You have artists who have studios, but there's nothing in them, but certain artists, I think Gardar is one of them, it's not making a work and then standing back and kind of, beholding, he beholds his own, creation or something. You make work for shows, you make work for a reason. And these things then go out into the world and they have to function in exhibitions. So, it's not painting for the pure pleasure of making something for the pleasure of the doing of it. You give yourself a kind of task.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. That's very much how I make the work. Which is also something that we discussed earlier in relation to collecting work and stuff like that too, is that I think that that's kind of just like a side issue to art. I mean, the work exists the way it exists now. I mean, it's not really work in my studio. It's work down there, and then, that's how it functions. And then if it's on someone's wall, it's also something different again, and less relevant maybe.
One of the things that I was curious about was to come here and see these works that I didn't know and had described, to see whether I was right or not, or if I was off or not, and it more or less it's right. It's no great insight of mine, but it speaks more to the fact that you have your sources, you have a plan, and so if I was able to see and be aware of the sources, as I was when we met, I could more or less imagine what those works would be, and that also goes to the sort of let's say execution of them or production of them. So I don't think of you as an artist with a certain touch. I didn't need to see a brushstroke. I didn't need to see a color, or I knew this would be gray, that would be pink. What I was wrong about were the copy machines. Mm-hmm. They're completely different objects than I could have possibly. But you might have even said to me, "Oh, I'm thinking of doing different sizes," and then you readjusted your plan because they're all the same size.
Yeah, there was some size adjustments there. Well, this printer is also the Bergen Kunsthall's old printer, so there's some kind of coincidence like that I like to kind of keep. So I think it's actually. Thanks to Steinar that this printer piece became so funny, I think, because this shape is so funny. I had kind of a different shape in mind, and it would have been a less funny looking piece. So.
It's also the material, because it looks like such an antique. You could say, well, copy machines, lots of technology already looks so obsolete and looks kind of antique or something. But the look of it goes to its, what it represents. To me, it doesn't look like a cop. Someone said at the opening, they said, "Oh, it looked like an old cash register." But it's funny too, because there's this idea of printing money or the exchange or the reproduction, or you have it with the stamps. But I think in context of the kind of remake of the blanket piece, to me, they almost looked like munitions. Like, if you went into an old armory and there were sort of cases of, grenades or landmines or whatever they would be, they kind of look, I don't know, they look like they have some kind of war.
Yeah, also related to that, I like that they look a lot like a Joseph Beuys piece. They're like a Joseph Beuys with like a reverse, like human angle or something like that.
Just so don't get the wrong idea. I don't think he's that's an important artist for Gardar or myself.
I would say the only thing maybe that changed from when we were talking about the text and adjustments that you made sort of during the text was that some pieces were taken out. I initially started with a slightly bigger pool of work, and then some things were taken out.
What was taken out?
I don't want to talk about that. Let's just say it's good that it was taken out.
I don't think we answered one of your questions. Maybe it was the general question of how we met or how we got started, or
Yeah, no, I think you touched upon both of them, but maybe you could describe to the audience a little bit about how what the text ended up, like the framework of the fiction.
oh. I didn't plan on this. I'm not that clever. It's often you discover things in the process of. It's similar to artists. You're problem solving. I had a problem. I had to write about works that didn't exist, right? And I don't know exactly where ideas come from. You're lucky to have them, or so I had this idea that if I had to figure out what these pieces were, and what they were about, and what would happen with them in the show, maybe I could create two characters who have to figure out what's going on with those pieces. So these two characters are sort of me trying to make my way through, right? So I already had this, and so the whole thing would be written as a dialogue, and I could throw questions out, and I could ask myself what was going on there. But the thing that, and again, I don't know where this idea came from, but it's possible.
When you presented it to me, I was like, don't do that.
Did you say that? No, but it changed. It changed. I know what I was going to do that, because the title of the show, can you translate the title of the show?
Laboratory for World Destruction.
Right. And then I said, where did that come from? And then you tell me where it came from. And then I started researching that person. And I feel like, I was going to interview this person from like 1912 or 1914. And you said, don't do that. So anyway, so I created two kind of anonymous characters. But again, when I'm saying you don't really know where ideas come from, it bothers me that people talk about, books are obsolete, catalogs are obsolete. Today, people publish things online. I like books. I like, if you write, you like books, and you like and you like the object of it, and so on. So I made the text, I kind of hyper-realized the text by deciding that I would set these characters at a point in the future, and they would find this catalog. So not only didn't the works exist yet for the show hadn't happened, and the catalog hadn't been printed. So I created this catalog that existed, that's discovered like 100 years from now by these two people who then make their way through the show, and they're just looking at reproductions. So, I was desperate. I had to have some idea of how to get into writing about things that didn't exist.
But I think that's also a funny thing that happened then, is that in your text you write about things in this catalog that you invented, and then when we were doing the catalog, we made certain kind of choices based on that, how you describe that catalog.
Right.
So there's page numbers in your imaginary catalog that was written like 3 months before the catalog came out that now correspond to actual pages in the real catalog.
Right. Yeah, I didn't know you had done that. I thought, that's an incredible coincidence. You did that, right? Thanks. Yeah. Yeah, that's how it got started. The other thing is, things take on a kind of momentum from that problem solving, which I think even relates to maybe your approach. But also, having these two characters, this fiction, this dialogue, I realized that for a long time, I've known your work 10 years, I've thought of your work as sort of theatricalized, as props, and always, because they're the props and then the gallery or the museum becomes the stage, the characters are missing. Mm-hmm. So I had these works that were missing that I had to imagine, and I created these characters to animate the ideas behind the props. But it wasn't all formulated in an instant, I kind of stumbled into it over a couple of days to get started writing.
And I think there are a lot of things in that text that that make a lot of sense in relation to my. I mean, I think science fiction makes a lot of sense and has been sort of a big part of my work, and it's been something that other people have also like picked up on. I had a catalog text previously that was just a science fiction short story that somebody wrote for a show, and it's something that I work with a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I knew, for example, I mean, we both like the writer Philip K. Dick, and you have a piece that I love, which is a quote from Valis, his book Valis. But then I also knew there would be other contributors to the catalog, and that one of them would be Nick Land. And I thought, oh, well, this is, I'm just an art writer. This is really a writer, And he's not just really a writer. He's actually retired, which, that's kind of what I've wanted to be for the last 5 years. So I felt like I had some competition. It's like, I'm just an art writer, and then there's this real writer, because, art is not really real. So writing about art isn't really real.
And actually, also one of the reasons I started to be interested in Nick Land was that we had these like kind of science fiction interests in common. I mean, he's written a lot about H.P. Lovecraft, and I like H.P. Lovecraft a lot. I've put him in shows, like curated him into shows, stuff like that. So there was also like a science fiction-y connection there, I thought.
But again, I go back to what I started with. I like the term imaginative fiction, and the writers that I like, they don't consider they don't consider it science fiction. Science fiction started off as sort of whatever, rocket ships and spacemen, all that. But really, that kind of fiction is about the world that we're living in right now. And so those are people, I mean, the big one is J.G. Ballard. I'm forgetting. She's my favorite writer, and I can't think of her name. Octavia Butler, which I think is interesting. The only black woman science fiction writer. But she doesn't. She's no longer living. She didn't consider what she wrote science fiction. There's an interesting book. She has one collection of short stories. She's not a short story writer. She just has this one little book, and it's called Blood Child. You should get it, Blood Child. At the end of every story, there's a very, very short piece that comes after, and she tells you exactly where she got the idea for the story. So you read this fantastical story, and then you realize she tells you at the end of the story that she just encountered this dispute between two people on a bus in Los Angeles, in present-day Los Angeles. It's great. You get this great story, and then she says, this is where it came from, and it's coming from right now, Anyway.
Steinar, any more questions?
Well, I think one of them was how we met, which is about 10 years ago. And I mean, I've said this over the last couple of days. You've heard it. But, to me, 10 years is a very short period of time. To me, 10 years is kind of, universe is billions of years old. 10 years, like 10 minutes or 10 seconds or something. So I feel like I'm just starting to understand something about your work. I'm not in a hurry. I really do think that it's a kind of a puzzle. Not your work, I mean everything, but art is kind of a puzzle, and you're sort of fitting the pieces together, trying to find that bigger picture and trying to make sense of it.
I think that's kind of relevant to my work, actually, this idea of like reading it over time. That's how I think about it when I make work, is that I don't create this like, singular piece that's supposed to contain all the meaning. I create pieces that work over time. So when someone sees my show, ideally for me, they would see some shows before and some shows after, and kind of that's where my kind of mediation of meaning lies, is through those years of seeing different attempts at talking about the issues that I'm interested in.
Yeah, one of the things I find interesting, there's two publications. There's the big book, but then there's something specific to this show. You sort of need both. But in the big book, again, I've known your work for 10 years. I saw so many things that I didn't know, or seeing them against things you've just made, I feel like, how do I put it? They're really forming a bigger picture. Like I'm still putting the pieces together. And then also there's a sense of this is what you do. But actually, when you look at that book, it's a very, very, it's a very varied practice, but within certain parameters, which I appreciate.
Yeah, and that was something we thought very specifically about when we did the book, that I really didn't want it to be chronological, because I think that that's not how I see my work. That's not the way my work exists in the world. You know, it all exists in like a contemporary time, and there's no difference. I mean, it doesn't mean anything that something was made 10 years ago or today.
Well, that was interesting to me too, to see in the catalog that you had done a show here 10 years ago, collaborative show, maybe you could talk, with copy machines.
Yeah.
You were obviously very aware of that, and you were aware of that.
Yeah, it was a kind of build your own fanzine show.
Who is the show with?
With my friend Matias Faldbakken, that's a Norwegian artist that I've collaborated a lot with. I think that's also actually a maybe lesser known part of my practice, is that I think I collaborate a lot with other artists. I collaborate with him a lot. Every year we make pieces together. Most of them never actually get made, but some of them do. But yeah, I collaborate with people all the time, and I really like it. It's a really fun aspect of my practice and of their practice, and it allows you to do something that's slightly off to the side of what you normally do, and I think it's always really interesting. And it's also completely impossible to sell collaborative work, so that's pretty good.
Except for Gilbert and George.
Yeah, well, if they're like a unit, it's like, then it works. But if it's like, you know, Richard Prince and Colin DeLand, nobody wants that work. That work is so awesome,
great, yeah.
But nobody wants it.
That's another fiction. They created an artist. But that 2004 show, people didn't see it. But you were able to come here and use the copy machines and make kind of quickly and cheaply your own zine, your own publication.
And then we invited a bunch of people to contribute material. So it was kind of a group show that you could there was like a large mass of kind of art by different people, and then you could curate your own show out of that somehow. You would build your own little selection from that. That was the purpose, at least. I'm not sure so many people did that, but that's what we wanted. I think a lot of people used it to copy their like school textbooks for free, actually.
So what? You know?
No, that's cool.
But it also seemed like a kind of work, a kind of show, a kind of situation. It's like situationism, particular to that time.
Yeah, for sure. That was funny seeing it now, you know, thinking that would be so anachronistic and weird now, you know? Who would make like a photocopied zine now? I mean, it would just look so nostalgic and corny. I mean, it was still maybe a little bit nostalgic then, but, you know, still had this kind of utilitarian aspect to it, which I think if you did it today, it would have like zero utilitarian value. And yeah, it would just seem nostalgic.
Mm-hmm. I don't want to put you too much on the spot, but thinking about 2004, 10 years later, and doing a show that was so much of that time, kind of situationist, or I don't know, it's more like a, you know, kind of that relational hip French kind of thing, which I'm not into. How do you see yourself 10 years later? You could say you're having a very different kind of show with things like paintings and objects, and
I mean,
it's 10 years later. You're the same person. I can see, you know, the continuity or that.
Yeah, I think there's a strong
time.
continuity, actually. I think the aesthetics are kind of the same, and I think there's not so much difference. I could still see myself doing that show again, or like a similar show again 10 years from now. There's no development in my practice.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, should borrow the microphone. perhaps you already answered it, but I was thinking about. You were talking about how we organize the book, not chronologically, and how that gives a special kind of view of the practice of Gardar Eide Einarsson over the 10 last years, seeing it that way. And in my introduction just a few minutes ago, I said something about how your practice has been like a series of exhibitions, like tracing the same sort of themes. And so when you first started working on the book, I imagined that we might want to show like exhibition for exhibition and seeing the work in relation to the other works in the exhibition, and the exhibition is really the statement. So the question would be then maybe how you work with individual works as part of an exhibition and then not outside the exhibition.
Yeah, I mean, I always think of them in relation to other works. I mean, for me, that's all. Like, if I made one of my paintings, it would just be totally pointless. I mean, it's about that painting's relation to other paintings that I made and other sculptures, both that are in the same show and that were in a different show. You know. So for me, like, the show is an installation, and that's how it works. But it doesn't mean that that's the only way it could work. Like, I could, if I installed this show in a different place, I'd install it totally differently. So there would be a different relation between the objects. And that's kind of what I thought with the book. Why I didn't want to do show by show was that, you know, so the works are in relation to each other in a specific show, but they're also in relation to each other outside of that show. So that this catalog was then a way to make a relation between all these works as like contemporary pieces, that they would all relate somehow like one installation, you know? But I don't know. You said the other day that your friend Olivier Mosset said that he doesn't want to make. He's not interested in making artworks anymore. He just wants to make exhibitions.
Right.
I thought that was pretty good. I mean, I feel like that's kind of related to the way that I think about it. In that, like, you know, the artwork in itself. I mean, it doesn't really mean that much. It's a way to kind of, like we were talking also with props. It's just setting up this kind of ongoing mediation.
Yeah, I mean, he's not precious about his work. You know, he doesn't he doesn't collect his own work. He doesn't keep things back because that's a great, you know, it's all more or less to go out into the world. Mm-hmm. It all functions, you know, in exhibitions. And I think the idea is that the exhibition is a place where people come and can interact somehow with that situation. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't see you either as being precious about something you do, or, you know.
Yeah, I just feel like that part of it is something kind of parallel and not that related, you know? Mm. The way that a painting will, like, accumulate some sort of monetary value or something like that. That exists, and, you know, that's how I pay my rent, but I think it's, like, pretty unrelated to art as a good thing, you know.
Should we? Yeah, I was going to say, should we open? Because I don't know what to say next. Yes.
The mic, or is it okay to just ask questions? Is it fine?
If you yell, it's fine.
So I just wondered if you could, as this is an installation, you made this exhibition. You had the question, could you be the festival exhibitor? We want a totally new show. We wanted totally new works, and we said we wanted to take the exhibition space, work with the architecture, and present something that hasn't been shown before. So I wondered if you could tell me and tell us a little bit about your thoughts about this installation as a whole and the project as such here. What did you think? Why did you come up with these exact works? Why did you put those together? How does it function?
Well, one thing I was kind of conscious of is that I wanted to kind of make it like a little bit more opaque and a little bit more kind of abstract, in that I wanted to take out, like, I've used specific figures in the past and as like kind of case studies, and sometimes I feel like people get like hung up on it and it kind of stops the interpretation a little bit. So I tried to kind of dial everything back a little bit and make it like even more sort of blank. I'm kind of happy with that, actually. Also because, like I said, I think about it over time. So I did a show in Norway not that super long ago that was quite extensive and had a lot of like more kind of figurative pieces, not just like visually more figurative, but like more kind of where the background, the backstory was kind of more prominent and pick upable, you know. So I kind of thought that I don't really need to, like, that kind of exists already. So I didn't really need to kind of redo that so much. And then in terms of the building, I mean, this space is super beautiful, and that's great. But that's also something that if I'm gonna make art about the things that I make art about, I also can't like uncritically just accept kind of the beauty and sort of authority of a building like that. So that's why, I mean, as you know, when we were installing, it was really important to try to like subvert that authority a little bit and to make kind of installation choices that were like annoying, you know.
What's annoying?
Well, there's a lot of annoying stuff there, but like when you come into the main room, for example, there's like kind of a strict logic to how all the paintings hang, the spaces between them and stuff. But the painting that hangs there is like hung, like it's not centered. It's also not like properly decentered. It's just hung in like an annoying way. And then, you know, we don't use any of the really good walls, or it's like we don't try to cover up the shitty parts, like the exits and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. So.
Yeah, one of the things I wanted to say, you said, oh, it's kind of a blank show or a minimal show, or you dialed it back. Going back to looking at the book and seeing the varied kind of work, and you mentioned figurative work, you know, you could make an entire show that would be, you know, a lot heavier, very political, very pop, very, I mean, you know, and that also, looking at some of those images in there, I had to ask myself, you know, why did I get interested in this guy's work all that way back? And sometimes you don't remember those first encounters because all of a sudden you're just kind of in the stream with someone and you're just going with them or trusting your instincts. But I realize why I was first attracted to your work is that there's a kind of anti-authoritarian position, you know, and I always relate to that, no matter what form it takes, whether it's in writing or whether it's in music or whether it's in art or whether it's just the person and who they are, and you know. But that was probably the initial attraction, I would think. Yes.
I wanted to ask you about the title. If you briefly touched the title and the title and the words, and talking about anti-authoritarian, I thought the title was quite authoritarian. I was just wondering about the title.
Well, I kind of wanted to, somehow when I was thinking about the show, I was thinking about it a little bit in terms of this kind of crisis situation, which I think is kind of always the situation, you know. So I wanted to make this parallel to, I don't know, it's not so clear in the show, but when I was thinking about it, I was somehow thinking about it as this kind of like post-apocalyptic scene somehow, where like these pieces were these kind of like artifacts. There's a lot of like dead technology and stuff like that. So I wanted it to have this kind of sort of apocalyptic flair a little bit. But then I also liked part of that title. I liked that, you know, maybe the gallery space can be this kind of laboratory where you can play out these like scenarios of destruction without it really having to mean actual destruction, you know. So for me, it was kind of a positive title, I thought.
But you should say where and when it comes from.
Well, yeah, it's a quote from Karl Kraus describing his contemporary situation and describing Vienna, I guess, as this sort of in a time of crisis. And I just thought that right now there seems to be kind of a crisis situation around anyway. And I also thought that then after I thought that, I was like, well, you know, that's always kind of the case, I guess.
He was also a major crackpot, you know, crazy guy. And I think you're attracted to certain characters. And so the other one who's present and absent with the blanket piece is Theodore Kaczynski, who was the Unabomber.
Yeah, and also there is this kind of like male hubris that I'm a little bit interested in. I mean, it's not just accepted for me. Like, it's not that I just, I think there's something kind of corny about this kind of, male hubris. So all these characters that I use usually have this sort of kind of tragic flair, but also this kind of ridiculous masculinity somehow. And I thought that's kind of, yeah.
You referred to Ballard and you paraphrased his book, Myths of the Near Future, in your introduction. And it seems to me that Ballard's fiction almost always is a kind of projection outward, a disintegration of the social as an outward projection of a state of psychological crisis. Do you think that kind of describes the way that you were thinking, both as artist and writer, in terms of this exhibition and text?
Well, I think you're right about what Ballard's up to. And speaking of a laboratory for world destruction, you could say that all of his writing, his entire worldview, comes from his experience as a child in Shanghai in a time of war. And I do think that, I don't think I'm answering your question. And you get criticized sometimes for looking at things that people like Ballard wrote in the early 60s and saying, you see, he was right, they came true. But, a lot of things actually did turn out badly in the way he imagined they were going to turn out.
I think actually, I didn't think I like Ballard a lot. I didn't think specifically about him making this show, but I think he's a really good reference for it, because I feel like the aesthetic is kind of similar. There's a sort of depressing minimalism to him, like this kind of, sort of built up suburban kind of, concrete monstrosity aesthetic that I feel like is kind of going on down there too. Steinar.
I have a question about the paintings in the show. First, maybe if you could describe how you see them as paintings and in how they work in the show. You already sort of labeled them props, or one of you did. And then maybe also for Bob was written a lot about painting and abstraction. How do you read these works?
Yeah, and why were these works not included in your book about abstract painting?
Well, the book was done in 2006 or 7.
Yeah, but you don't need my work to exist to write about it.
Maybe I don't like those paintings. No, I think when you told me about these paintings, I just thought, oh my God, what do these even have to do with anything he's doing in his work? I don't know what to write about. I don't want to write about them. I was a bit worried. But then, so I questioned, and it's funny the way you say that you hung it. It's kind of not in the center, but it's not really off center. And then, we're talking about the gray paintings, the steel paintings. And you were talking about them. That's when I started to get a handle on it, when you were saying it's almost like just taking the way, you would take something and just like board up a building, just cover up the windows, and it's all done in a very ad hoc way. It's just sort of like, this has been bombed out or abandoned, or the rioters are coming and we're gonna what?
Ad hoc Reinhardt.
Yeah, and so then I understood them as part of a sort of architecture disaster scenario. So then they had subject matter. They weren't just gray paintings and pink paintings. I'm still not sure about them.
Well, yeah, what he said. They were about creating this. Like we said, I used to call my paintings prop paintings. They would all be called prop painting and then something else. And they'd
be propped against the wall,
yeah.
Little blocks.
And then I thought that was maybe a little heavy-handed. That's why I stopped doing that. But I still feel like that. I mean, I still feel like they're kind of just stand-ins for their like paintings a little bit, you know. So I like that they were just this like creation of some kind of backdrop, you know. And then also there was this like activity of like covering that I was kind of attracted to. And then of course there too there is this kind of interrogation of this like kind of corny masculinity of making a painting that's that size, and sort of it immediately becomes kind of gestural, and like there's this, you know, you can't really do that without like forcing painterliness into it. It's like impossible to not have painterliness in a painting like that, even though what I'm just doing is just covering, you know, the way it would almost the way you would like paint your house.
But
or
there's
something.
also a reference to, let's say, people writing, you know, political or you know, graffiti or just things against kind of this like anti-system, and then someone coming and just so they're only covering over where something has been put out in public as a statement. It's to efface it, to get rid of it. So so it's actually not random. It's not, you know.
Yeah, and there's also, for me, there's also a lot of, you know, there are different reasons. Some are like less, I mean, some are a little more corny and poetic. In the case of the stainless steel ones, I was really attracted to that. I mean, the title is just the name of the color. So there was a color called stainless steel, parentheses, fine. And I thought that was a really poetic title. And that was also part of the reason why I wanted to use it, you know.
So I was just wondering, would you say the same thing about the other paintings, the one that are black and white, the one you've done? How would you differ the way you characterize those type of paintings in contrast to the grey and the pink ones? And Bob, would you say the same about those other paintings as you do the grey ones? Would you consider those differently? You said you're not sure about the grey ones. How do you feel the difference between those two types of painting in his work?
You know, in the text, again, grasping for some way to deal with, I think I referred to them as a composite body. So the idea is that the gray was the outside and the pink was the inside. But honestly, that was really meant to refer to them almost as like bodies in space or something. But I'm not answering your question. Yeah, I mean, it's funny too, because somebody we haven't mentioned, but I think about a lot, and really a lot in relation to your work once I saw the book, and certain one artist, American artist who no longer works, is Katie Nolan. And I was thinking about how she was looking at certain objects as being stand-ins or barricades, or so again, the figure is really absent. But then, you know, the doors open and people come in for the opening and come to the gallery. And so you start to, the exhibition starts to be inhabited or populated. So they have a certain, you know, they have a certain function in relation to what could happen. But, you know, I don't see them in relation to, I don't want to offend you, you know, relation to like the monochrome or the history of abstract painting or so. I don't see that. That's a very superficial thing.
But yeah, a little bit related to that is that one thing that I kind of have in the back of my mind when I'm installing shows, or like as a kind of model for installing a show, is this idea of like a shooting range or like a fairground or something like that, where these elements, like you create this kind of sort of hodgepodge of like images that has to be moved through. I mean, I do try to think about it. I think about that it has to be populated and you know, by the visitor or whatever.
But she referred to some works as stand-ins, and as other works as stand-ins for stand-in, you know, as if it's all replaceable. Again, not investing something in that one object. I noticed most of the people who left were sitting on this side of the room. So thanks to all the people who on this side of the room who didn't leave. Maybe it's because they're closer to the window and they can see what's otherwise available besides what's available. But anyway, thanks to the people who didn't leave from that side. And also to the people on that side of the room who are the most large group of people who didn't leave at all. These are the people on the left, our left. Are there any questions? Yeah.
It's not a question, it's actually a comment, and I think Anna remembers best. One of the works that I really liked and that you did when you had your final exhibition, the degree show, was that you made a painting talking about stand-ins now, and you left it outside in the city space for people just to move it. So it really just became a prop.
Mm-hmm. Which they did. They moved it after like a day. It was in the garbage. So.
And I think that was a really nice, interesting gesture. You moved the exhibition space outside of the exhibition, of course. Now here it's another version of that.
Thanks.
Can we move the things outside?
Yeah.
No.
The bronze sculptures.
There's one work outside, though. I don't know if everyone's seen it.
Yeah,
or
that's not really my work.
No? What's that?
That's graphic design. I didn't do that. That's like a promotional material.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
I like it.
It's the
No, because-
best piece in the show.
But what the text is?
The text is
weaving-
from one. Yeah, the
Yeah,
I
but
mean
it
the
says,
text is
"Weaving
from my piece.
spiders
Come not here.
come not here." It's on the outside, so it's kind
It's
of
the
like
text
saying-
that's on the plates downstairs.
Yeah, but it's kind of like saying, anyway, a weaving spider is, how would you describe it? It's
Well, in the logo, it's used for this Bohemian Grove gathering as a sort of to try to tell people to leave their kind of political ambitions at home and just
or the kind of deals and
Right,
deal
right,
making
right.
that they want to do in those social situations,
Mm.
which is interesting because that's exactly what people do today. Every sort of social situation which involves, business, politics, and all that, that's the coming together. They do it wherever they do it, at economic conferences but having that on the outside of the building is sort of like saying, if that's where you're at, you shouldn't come in. And that's how I read it. Come in and see the show. Yeah.
Yeah, on the fiction, science fiction, imaginative fiction thing, again, could that be a useful strategy for thinking about contemporary practices in order to avoid a kind of automatic response of trying to put things into a very kind of rigid, linear, historicizing process? I just think about terms that have been used in recent years, like a few years back, Gardar's work was being referred to as new conceptualism or neo-conceptualism or something like that. The big show at the moment in the museum in Oslo is Ida Ekblad, that's been referred to as a new modernism. But is it that? Is that just like a really kind of convenient, lazy way of describing something? Could there be other ways of thinking about that?
You can't imagine how that idea sets me off, that there's something called neo-conceptualism. And when you want to talk about fiction, calling a lot of artists today conceptual is one of the biggest fictions of all time. And it's perpetuated by a lot of writers, critics, museums, institutions. I would think that a lot of people confuse a concept with an idea. They're not the same thing. A lot of artists have ideas, but it's almost as if you could say, well, you mentioned, it's a new kind of modernism. The thing is that, the misunderstanding, you can jump in anytime, the misunderstanding of conceptualism is that it's some sort of art movement, like Fauvism, Expressionism, Minimalism, pop art. There's not an art that's conceptual. It's really the conceptualism is really a way of looking at the world and your place in the world. It's not a style. It's not something, there's not a formula. And I think that possibly I don't know, over the last however many years, because of people teaching in schools, that certain younger people think that they can learn how to make an artwork that is conceptual. And, you don't even need to be bothered to have a concept. You just have to have an idea, or you just have to have a formula, or you just, whatever you do. So that really bothers me. I could just go on and on, but nobody can convince me otherwise. It's not, as I said, you have impressionism and expressionism and there's not conceptualism. It's not a style. It's not a movement. It's a way of thinking about, your place in the world, or an object's place in the world, or whether there should be something or shouldn't be something. It's not a way of making or doing. In fact, often it's not doing.
And it's also like something that, like, yeah, that neo-conceptualist thing, like, comes up a little bit. I know the person who kind of came up with that or whatever.
Who came up with that?
I think it was Jonas Ekeberg. He's a Norwegian guy. And, but I mean, whatever. That's kind of his job to come up with stuff like that. And then it's like my job to ignore it. I mean, a little bit. I don't know. I mean, in relation to science fiction, I thought also, like, the thing that I really like about science fiction is that, or the science fiction that I like is that it's, like, very ambitious and smart, but kind of in, like, a genre that isn't supposed to be, So there's this kind of overachieving within, like, kind of within that boundary that I think is really cool. And I think it also allows for some, like, weird, like, murkiness, You can have, like, a very ambitious idea in a novel and also allow other shit to go on, That's, like, less kind of properly there. I think, like, H.P. Lovecraft, for example, it's like that. There's so many interesting things going on that are, like, just, like, murky and strange,
Any more questions from the audience?
You said something the other day about some works coming out of others, but that in Gardar's kind of practice, that it's a bit like it's their own parent, kind of. You can't be your own parent, but that some works that were made kind of after another work.
Oh, yeah.
Like
I don't know if I agree with myself 2 days later. No, it's just that, you can say, I made this work, and out of that work came this work, and out of that work came this work. And I feel like you sometimes make the third work, then you make the first work. That the only work that's in the right, if there's such thing as a right place, is the one in the middle. In other words, because we were thinking about the catalog not being chronological. And not putting the information in chronological order is kind of like saying that, certain artists are moving back and forth in their mind around ideas, or circling back around to something from before and bringing it into the, you don't sit down and say, well, this is the work I'm making on Monday, and then this is the work I'm making on Tuesday. Things happen, and it's more organic. I like to say the tide goes in and the tide goes out. It doesn't come in and out at the same time every day. But so, yeah, I guess I still think about that. Like a work you made, I don't know. That's the thing, too. You sometimes look at someone's work and you can say, oh, these are early works. And if you take the dates off, it's really difficult to see where did things come in place, which is why you don't need to put things chronologically. Because this doesn't follow that in a logical way. I don't know.
Well, okay, if you don't have any more to add, I think we might end it here. So thank you so much, Bob and Nolan.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.